A day after officially entering the Republican race for president, Miami Mayor Francis Suarez told my colleague Jose Diaz-Balart that he would consider pardoning the former president if he were convicted in the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. Here it is.
If I became president of the United States, I think the pardon power, one of the possible reasons for using the pardon power is to heal the country. So, who knows what will happen? He's innocent until proven guilty. He has not been proven guilty. But certainly if I became president, one thing I would look at as president is using the pardon power to heal the country.
But as columnist Josh Barrow writes, he says the fact that Mr. Trump remains the clear front runner in the race speaks to a bigger issue facing the Republican Party. He writes, quote, "When your opponent is so popular, the voters don't care if he gets indicted. Your problem isn't the indictment. It's his popularity." And for more, I'm joined by Jeff Mason, the White House correspondent for Reuters, a college classmate of mine, believe it or not. Maria Teresa Kumar, president and CEO of Voto Latino and an NBC News contributor. And Danielle Pletka, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and also an NBC News contributor. Jeff, since we go further back than with the ladies at this table, I'll let you have the first one here. Do you think Francis Suarez's position here on pardons, this is like a new narrative in the 2024 campaign, that offering a pardon to Trump could win over some Trump supporters? Is that the thinking that each of these candidates has to sort of grapple with right now?
I think the candidates are trying to find a way to talk about what's going on with Donald Trump and finding a way to do that will appeal to his voters. And the pardon is something that they can offer. It's something that they can say, this is what I'll do. Don't vote for that guy because he's been indicted, but I'll be happy to pardon him if I win the office. So, yeah, I think that's the race that they're engaging in right now, and it's kind of just fascinating to see them do that before this has even seen the light of day in a courtroom.
We've marinated on the document for less than a week, and already this pardon issue is a real issue. Danny, you write about it in the New York Times. You say that President Biden should pardon Donald Trump, that President Biden should be the one pardoning Donald Trump. And here's what you say specifically. Selective prosecution is not a defense in a court of law, but the court of public opinion is another matter. Millions will see Trump's prosecution as illegitimate and any conviction as unjust. That will further erode public confidence in our judicial system and the principle of equal justice under law. So wouldn't this undermine the sort of system of justice, though, if President Biden were to pardon Donald Trump?
Look, in every Mark Thiessen and I make the argument very clearly that the indictment of former President Trump is a very powerful document and a very persuasive document as well. This is less about the question of the classified documents and more about the cycle and the precedent that it breaks. We have never indicted a former president. Now, we can say, rightly, no former president, no president has acted the way that Donald Trump has. On the other hand, we can look at other countries. South Korea, they don't have a single president who hasn't at some point been in jail. We can be that country. We can be a country where, elect me, I'm going to go after my predecessor, and then the next guy's going to say, elect me, I'm going to go after his family. What does that do to the fabric of our Constitution? What does that do to our society? That's the argument.
So where do you draw the line? We could see other federal indictments, including in Georgia right now, the famous phone call there with Brad Raffensperger. We could see an indictment here in Washington, D.C. surrounding what happened on January 6th. Does the pardon apply to any of those?
So I'm not running for president. I was born in Australia, so I can't. So I'm not offering to pardon Donald Trump a priori. But I do think there's a powerful argument to be made that President Biden could be the person to do this. He is the one who said in his inaugural, which I thought was a wonderful, wonderful speech, he is the one who said, I want to heal the nation. That is not what's happened.
Maria, is that a get-out-of-jail-free card?
I have to say that for the millions of people who've been falsely incarcerated for smaller penalties, this idea that someone who actually has receipts of espionage, of an attempted coup, of voter fraud, all of it, to not have any penalty is not going to sit well with the majority of American people.
To be clear, he's not accused of espionage, though this is...
I'm sorry, yes. Under the Espionage Act. So I think that one is we have to see the day in court. We have to allow to do what the subcommittee on the commission on the president, on the Liz Cheney's committee. Now I lost my train of thought. But basically, we have to, the January 6th, thank you. So I do think that we have to connect. What is happening right now with the Justice Department is what we saw very clearly with the subcommittee on the, again, I lost my train of thought.
On the January 6th.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that in order for us to be able to be fair and say, let's actually let's listen to the case. Let's listen clearly to the American people. Let's bring it forward. But this idea to demand that, or to request a sitting president to pardon someone who has clearly been held and indicted on certain crimes is not only preemptive, but it actually doesn't do justice to our judicial system and to Americans' trust in the judicial system.
Danny, is the bigger issue here for Republicans Trump's legal challenges or Trump's popularity within the party?
Well, that's obviously a huge issue. But I don't think we should forget that all of this is in the context of people's perceptions. Hillary Clinton committed arguably pretty serious violations of the Espionage Act herself. Again, not espionage. And there was documented and confirmed outside interference in her private homebrew server in her backyard. And she wasn't indicted. And the reason for that at the time, the judgment that was made was it would be bad for the election, it would be bad for the country to do that. Now, again, you know,
I'm not sure that's true.
No.
You think there just wasn't evidence and that she seemed to have a homebrew server?
It's not at all about what I think. It's about what they said at the time. I mean, the leader of the FBI said no reasonable prosecutor would prosecute her based on the information that we have here.
Because it was destroyed, you mean? Because it was entirely bleached.
Again, it doesn't matter what I think.
Yeah.
It matters what he says.
So
He did not say this would have an impact on the election. I think the evidence shows it did have an impact on the election.
Oh, it did.
Exactly
And
right.
she
But
lost.
I think they
Right.
thought, well,
That's exactly
anyway,
right.
we can go on and on about what we think they thought.
Is not prosecuting
Well,
Hillary Clinton the reason why you should or shouldn't prosecute Donald Trump?
That's
At some
a great
point, we have
question.
to move on. Let me ask you guys, stick with us for a moment. I want to get back to this, but we have some new reporting to share when it comes to the presidential race. The political organization No Labels, a lot of folks have paid close attention to this, tells NBC News that it will end its effort to field a third-party candidate if polls show President Biden way ahead of Trump next spring. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard helped break that story and is joining me now. Vaughn, walk us through what led to No Labels' decision. This has caused a lot of concern, the potential for third-party candidate in a series of different places, one of them called 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Right, and Peter, this is the first time that on the record No Labels is suggesting explicitly that they could end their effort here. They are currently paying for ballot access in states around the country for this would-be unity ticket that would include a Republican and one Democrat, potentially Joe Manchin, who is not dismissed the idea at this point in time. They are looking toward having a convention this next April, and I want to let you hear from Dr. Ben Chavis. He's a longtime civil rights activist. He's also a Democrat and a co-chair of No Labels here, because they have been receiving quite a bit of scrutiny, especially from the left, about potentially being a spoiler for Joe Biden next November. I want to let you listen to Dr. Chavis when I asked him about this effort. Take a listen.
After Super Tuesday next year, before the convention in Dallas in April, there will be a decision. And if we find that the polls have changed and Joe Biden is way, way out ahead, and the person on who the Republicans may choose, and if they continue to choose Donald Trump, even though he's been indicted, then No Labels will stand down, because we're not interested in being a spoiler.
The issue that some Democrats I've talked to, even since that interview with Dr. Chavis, is the fact that he is not, and No Labels is not suggesting that they would step away if the polls show that it is a dead heat between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, which is a situation in which they say would be that spoiler situation, Peter.
I mean, and so, Vaughn, thank you for that reporting. What's striking is the panel joins us again here, right? So if he's way out front, they're not going to waste their money on this situation. But if it's close, then they're comfortable being, I mean, they say they don't want to be a spoiler. That's when, for Democrats' perspective, they would be a spoiler. How big of a threat is No Labels to Joe Biden in 2024?
Just this idea of floating that there could be another potential candidate to unify the country in a moment where we recognize that we need a president and the vice president as strong as possible is a spoiler. And what the American people, I think, realize is that we are living in delicate times where it's no longer just about party, but it's about who actually believes in democracy. And we saw that through the red wave that never happened. We saw independent and moderate Republicans coming to the rescue in the midterm elections because they recognized that the current state of the Republican Party is a de facto Trump party. And they don't want any of that. So this idea of might be playing with a third-party candidate, it's going to upset, too, not the Republicans. It'll absolutely upset the Democrats.
Jeff, we work the same beat together at the White House. You hear private rumblings among Democrats about the idea that there could be someone else who enters this race and takes some of those independent-minded voters votes away from Joe Biden.
From Joe Biden. And there's a reason that they're concerned about that. Look at how close these last two presidential elections were in certain states. I mean, if you...
It's not even states anymore. It's like regions of states at this point.
Exactly. I mean, if you grab 100 votes here, 1,000 votes there, 2,000 votes there, that can make all the difference between a state that could turn the election.
Danny, for you, is there any time where no labels could potentially draw Republican-minded voters away? Or is this all about impacting Joe Biden?
So two things. Number one, I think this is the first time that no labels actually was sort of getting a lot of chat, a lot of consideration, a lot of attention, and they have now single-handedly undermined themselves with this. Because, in fact, what they are about is the Democrat winning. Well, that just makes them an arm of the Democratic Party. Okay, that's part one. What was the second? What was the question?
Well, I guess, I mean, does that make them an arm of the Democrat? If Joe Biden's way out, I guess that makes them an arm, right? Because that means they want Biden to win. But they're also saying if it's close that they're willing to get in, which means they could undercut Joe Biden.
That was completely incoherent, but that was completely incoherent. But as to, I remember what your question was, even if you don't. So
could it impact Republican-minded voters and take votes away from them?
I think absolutely. Look, if you say, okay, if you're a Republican like me and you're not going to vote for Donald Trump and you're not going to vote for Joe Biden and Joe Manchin gets in and he's a very conservative Democrat, he's not going to win in West Virginia. So, if he gets in, I think that would be something that people would actually seriously consider. It's something I would seriously consider.
Maria, you watched Joe Biden. He's going to go accept some union endorsements tomorrow. We saw him today in Connecticut. Tomorrow's really, though, his first sort of political event since making it official he'd run in 2024. In 2020, the criticism was he was in the bunker in the basement, so to speak. This time around, he's pretty happy being kind of off the radar. Is that enough to energize voters, many of whom are concerned, among other things, we acknowledge, about his age and about his sort of vigor to do 4 more years?
So I think that when you take a step back and look at the collective group of policies that he's implemented, what we're going to see about the Joe Biden presidency with Kamala Harris is that it has been monumental. And I think what you're going to see is the union stepping up and saying the reason that everybody's now has more access to broadband, the reason that you have $35 insulin, it is because of the Joe Biden policies. Oh, and that bridge that we're about to build, that's also because of Joe Biden. And so a lot of times people like to go after his age as if it's a deficit, but I can't think of any other political person right now that has the depth of understanding how the workings of Capitol Hill needs to be able to maneuver and the individuals they need in order to win policy. Everybody talks about the incredible job that Barack Obama did with the Affordable Health Care Act. One of his policies, whether we're talking about the IRA, whether we're talking about the American Rescue Plan, it basically overshadows just that ACA.
The luxury is we have 17 more months to talk about this. So
Aren't we lucky?
We'll visit this conversation again. Nice to see you, Maria. Teresa, Danny, Jeff, always good to have you with us.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.